Good evening and welcome to Undercover. This is the show that looks between the covers of books by Missoula area authors. My name is Dave Pauley. I'm director of the Missoula Public Library, and this show is jointly produced by the Missoula Public Library and Missoula Community Access Television and Fact and Fiction Bookstore. And we're happy to have you with us. And we're really happy to have Barbara Corcoran with us tonight. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
This is an encore appearance for you. It was, I think, over a year ago that you first came on our show. And I wanted to ask you, before we get started talking about your new book, which is called Wolf at the Door, about the book I talked to you about a year ago. I hope I'm right. The title was Stay Tuned, I think?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yes, that's the one that was dedicated to the pea green boat.
Right. Since we haven't been together and talked about your books for a while, I just wonder if you can tell me how that book did, or...
It's doing quite well. It's kind of hard to tell in the first year because the publishers are busy paying themselves back the advance, and I'll know in April really how it's doing. But it's done medium well, I would say. It's not walking off with a Newbery or anything.
Okay, well, I was just interested since we hadn't talked to you for a while. Now, this new book called Wolf at the Door is, about wolves and their relationships to human beings, and the story really revolves around a wolf pack. I just wonder where you came by this interest in wolves that you evidence in this book.
Well, I was thinking about that because I thought you might ask me. And I think the very first time I was aware of wolves, I grew up in New England and we don't have too many wolves hanging around there. Right. I was at the University of Colorado, and I used to go into the zoo in Denver. And I went in one day, and they had this big, I think it was a new arrival, a big crate sort of sitting out away from everything else, and it had a beautiful timber wolf in it, pacing back and forth. It seemed to me not been there very long. And I was worried about him because he didn't have very much space. And I went back 3 or 4 times and just sat there and looked at him. He was so beautiful. And then I think I put wolves out of my mind. This was in the 60s. And until I came to Montana. And I wrote a book called Sasha, My Friend. And actually the wolf in that is only in it for a short time. But it's the wolf that the children loved in that book every time. I still get letters about it, although it's out of print. And they carry on about why did I have to kill the wolf, and oh dear. So I thought, well, wolves are a good topic. So then I started doing some, I was living here then, doing some books on wild animals, and I did one called Silver Wolf. And to do that one, it's kind of the story of a life of a wolf from infancy on. I had to do a great deal of research because I really didn't know anything about wolves. And right about that time, David Meach, who is the authority on wolves, came out here and gave a lecture. And I went to hear it and got more and more interested and did that book. And it did quite well, but I had sort of begun to have a thing about wolves. And then a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I guess, Dorothy Patton told me about a place up near Flathead Lake where they had a domesticated pack of wolves. And one day she called and said, would you like to go up and see them? And I did, and it was one of the great afternoons of my life. There were I guess, 15 or more wolves there. And very friendly, not right at first. They're kind of like a dog that you don't know. They come out and sniff around and back away and all that, but in no time at all, very friendly, untying my shoelaces, sniffing the back of my neck, and all that kind of thing. And I was hooked. I decided I had to do this, some kind of book. Actually, I did about 4 versions of this book before I got this one. And the only thing that stayed the same through the 4 versions was the wolves. I kept kept trying to make the wolf story and the human story mix, and I had trouble doing that until I finally worked it out this way.
Well, since you mentioned wolves and humans, there's obviously a complex relationship going on between our species and theirs.
Seems to be,
And
yes.
some of us are fearful and full of hate, as some of the people you portrayed in the book, and some people like you are absolutely enchanted with wolves.
It's strange that apparently there's been this kind of legendary thing about wolves for centuries. You hear about those stories in Russia where they chased the sleigh, and one theory about that is that they were not after the people, they were after the horses, because hooved animals is the game that they go for. And every book I've read on wolves says that there has never been a record of a wolf harming a human being in this country. And I just can't believe that they do, because they seem so friendly and so there's a kind of rapport, the way you have with dogs that you like, you know.
Well, I was going to ask you that. They are portrayed, especially with the main character Lee, as having a real connection, and she has absolutely no fear of them, and they are friendly and loving in a way to her. Are wolves really like that with people, or can they be like
Well,
that?
the ones that I saw were. Of course, in the wild, they're very shy, and I think one reason people that didn't know much about them was because it was hard to get near them. And David Meach said that he spent, I think, a whole winter on Isle Royal in Michigan trying to study a pack of wolves, but he never could get close. But then he went up to, I think, Antarctica, and they were not used to people. They hadn't seen people. And he moved right in and lived with them, built himself a little hut, stayed there all winter, and they were perfectly friendly with him, not shy.
I guess I'm thinking of Farley Moat's book, too, about wolves and how...
I don't think too much about Farley Moat's book. I've heard that the facts are questionable.
Oh, okay. Well, it's
Oh,
one of the books I recalled about wolves.
Yeah. Yes, I read it too, and I was entranced with it, and then I heard that that a lot of that just came out of his head.
But you've obviously done research and seen wolves similar to the wolves in this
Yes, I have.
in this pack that
Yes.
you described here. Well, actually, the wolves were quite fascinating, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about the people in the book, too. These two sisters, Lee and Savannah, are
Right.
quite different and quite competitive in some ways. I was guessing that maybe Lee, there was a little bit of you in Lee, since she has aspirations to be
Probably.
a writer. What about,
Unconsciously, but probably.
what about Savannah? Where did that kind of she's a hogging the limelight type of person?
Well, I used to work in the theater, and I've known a lot of actors, young and old, and I think that they tend to do that. They get a little subtler about it when they're older than Savannah. But she you have to be very determined to be either a writer or an actor because there's so many pitfalls, so many obstacles. And I think it's the ones like Savannah who make it to the top. She'll make it, I'm sure, just the way her grandmother did.
And the grandmother, of course, is another story.
Yeah.
A well-known actress, very famous, and sort of like the role model for Savannah. But the thing I thought was interesting about her is she never really was present with the rest of the family until two-thirds of the way through the book. But
Right.
yeah, you could feel her influence all the way
Yes.
through that.
Yes,
And she
on
had-
all of them.
Yeah, and everybody had a different sort of relationship
Yeah.
with her, including the son-in-law, who,
Who's starstruck.
I
Yes.
guess, yeah. Well, what about her? Was she patterned on any particular person you've ever known?
The
or-
grandmother?
The grandmother.
Well, she's kind of a mix of a number of people. I lived in Hollywood for about 15 years and worked sort of in and around theater people and screen people. And I've known aging actresses like that. Yes. They hate to let go.
Yeah, she did. Well, I want to go back a little bit to the scene where they discover this wolf in this little cage, horribly maltreated, in fact, dying, and they rescue the wolf. And this guy had this little sign up that said zoo, and he had some other pathetically mistreated animals.
Yeah, I think actually that there's a law against that in Montana now, but
Right.
there used to be a lot of those around.
I can remember
So-
from my childhood,
Can you?
they would keep bears in
Yes.
little cages.
Yeah.
You don't find that anymore.
No, I rationalized it by thinking, well, he's in an out-of-the-way place and he's breaking the law, and he knows he is, or else most of the people who read it won't know that there's a law against having those little zoos, one way or the other.
Yeah.
Poetic license.
Well, they certainly were a feature not all that long ago of a lot of little roadside stops.
Yes, I remember them too. Yeah.
Well, what about zoos in general? How do you feel about zoos?
Well, at the time when I saw my wolf in Denver, I used to go to zoos all the time whenever I lived where there was one, but you always felt bad because they were caged in. Now, of course, they're much more open, and I think maybe Balboa Park in San Diego was one of the first. And that's a delight. I mean, you go there, I don't know if it's a delight for the animals, but you feel better about them because they're out in the open and not housed up in those little cages.
Yeah, I've had some problems with zoos over the years, but
Yeah.
I guess it's a different thing now. In fact, it may be a chance for survival for some animals.
Yes, yes.
Well, what about wolf recovery in particular, since I guess that can be a pretty controversial issue in Montana, and you make that clear in your book. There are some
Yes.
people who are adamantly opposed to the idea of wolves regenerating or living in this.
Well, I think I can understand sheep ranchers and cattle ranchers worrying about it because the wolves don't have enough of the kind of animal they used to eat. You know, they're not enormous deer herds racing around, and they're elk and all those big animals. They've got to eat something, and I suppose it can happen. Defenders of Wildlife, as you probably know, I think I said in the preface to the book, rewards any rancher that can prove that a wolf ate one of his animals. They don't normally do it, but I suppose it can happen, and I don't blame them for worrying about it. On the other hand, Yellowstone, I don't understand why there's a controversy about that. I mean, we've got everything else in Yellowstone, and wolves are not going to hurt people. Bears do, bison may, you know, but wolves wouldn't. So I don't know why they have a fuss about that.
Is there an active wolf recovery program outside of national parks, or do you know if that's going
Well,
on
I
anywhere
think
else?
Defenders of Wildlife and some of those other organizations are working on it cautiously, as I understand it.
What would be the case for recovery of wolves? I mean, is there any practical reason why we should do it, or is it beyond that?
Well, not practical in a practical sense. Practical in the sense that it's a good thing to have wild animals around us. You know, they belong here, and the wolves used to be all over this country. Red wolves down south and the gray wolves in the rest of the country. And now they're almost gone, except in Canada. And I don't think we should let them go. There's not a practical money reason for having them here. They're not edible, and you can't have a wolf burger the way you can have a buffalo burger, but maybe aesthetic, maybe ambience, things like that.
Well, a little bit about, since your main character, Lee, has aspirations of being a writer, I just wanted to, when I read the little part in the back about your life and the various experiences you've had, how do you think all that prepared you or helped you to be a writer, or did it?
Oh, I suppose everything you do does, you know. At the time, it may not seem so. I came out of college right in the middle of the Depression, and you didn't have options. You didn't say, I think I'd like this kind of a job or that kind of a job. You just were lucky if you found any job at all. So I've had some very strange and boring jobs. And at the same time, I there's always something about one of them that I can look, any one of them that I can look back at and think, well, I made this friend there, or I learned something about organization, and when I was a filing clerk, you know. I think it all adds up. I tried to stay as close to writing jobs as I could. I worked for a little while at the Authors Guild in New York, and when I was in Los Angeles, I worked at Celebrity Service for 8 years, which was the longest time I ever stayed in one job. And among the other things that I did, I put out a bulletin every day, and you could hardly call it writing, but arrivals and departures of celebrities in town, but then also a little biographical sketch of somebody.
Oh.
And it was fun. That's the reason I stayed there so long.
Celebrity Service, it was called?
Yes, it was an information service for the industry. If somebody wants a star on a radio show, it was radio then, radio show, and can't find her, they'd call us, find her for us, and we would. By hook or by crook, sometimes by crook.
Well, how did you end up in Montana? I know that this is so grounded in Montana, and so many of the references are things that you can immediately say, oh yeah, I know where Goldsmith is. They went there to have a banana split, and they sat out by the river. So I wonder how you came to.
Well, I was in Los Angeles working at Celebrity Service. Los Angeles, when I first went there right after the war, was ideal to me. I came from a little town in New England where writers were considered odd, or it was a hobby, you know, or something, and I was very serious about it. And I went as far away from home as I could get, which was Hollywood, and I had been working in summer theaters, so I knew quite a few people who had gone out there. And after a year or two, I got the job at Celebrity Service, and so by the end of, well, altogether I was there about 10 years. Los Angeles had changed so fast and so unimaginably. It just wasn't that nice, pleasant place where everybody was a writer or an actor or a director or something. And the freeways were in and all that sort of thing. So I came up here to visit a friend of mine from Hollywood who had come up here and instantly fell in love with Missoula. This was in 1952. And was lucky enough to ask Art Mosby at KGVO Radio if he needed a copywriter, and he said, as it happens, I do. So I went back and packed things up and came here and stayed 2 years. I got my MA here the second year, and then I couldn't get a job. I thought I was going to teach at the university, and the legislature did what they always do. And
oh, it's an ongoing story.
yes. So I had to leave, but as soon as I started writing full-time, I came back here.
Well, what about now that you've been writing a while? Most writers have told us on the show that they don't have anything to do with the choice of the artwork or the cover.
No,
Is
you
that
don't.
true with you?
You don't.
No matter how well known you get, you still don't?
Oh, I think probably Judy Blume has something to say about it, but I don't.
Okay. Are you satisfied with most of
I
what
love
you've done?
that one.
That's
No,
a
I'm
really
not
good
always satisfied. No.
Okay.
I was very happy when that came.
Yes, I was going to say, I really like that one, too. What about letters? You alluded to letters that you still get about certain books. Do you get many letters from your
Quite a lot.
readers?
Quite a lot, yes. Often it's a whole batch of letters because the teacher said write an author, you know, that kind of thing. I'm never too thrilled with that.
Right.
But I get quite a few. They write and just say, I happen to read. Often they're reading books that are out of print. Of course, I suppose they get them at the library.
At the library, sure.
And of course, Sasha, my friend, is the one they write about most. And I had a mother write to me and say that she read Sasha when she was a teenager, and her daughter had just brought it home from the library, and where could she get a copy? I don't even have a copy myself anymore. I've given away all my copies. that was a stupid one, I think, to put out of print, because it does go on, and people would buy it if it were there.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a problem for libraries too. If we'd like to buy another
I
copy,
know.
it's really difficult sometimes.
Your problems are our problems.
That's right. What about, are you with the same company as a publisher that you have been for quite a while?
Except for about 4 or 5 books along the way. Every book I've had published was with Athenaeum, and with the same editor, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
And I just heard today that there's been all this business about Paramount buying out Macmillan and so on, and we were afraid that Athenaeum was going down the drain, but it isn't.
Oh, that's
They're
good.
keeping 4 imprints, and Athenaeum is one of them, so I was much relieved. Because when you've sold that often to one house, it's hard to get another house interested in you.
They're happy with you, obviously. Are you happy with them as far as
Oh,
what
yes.
they do for you?
I hope that Jean Carl, my editor, I think this one says that Jean Carl imprint, will still be doing it, because I can't imagine working without her. You know, she's a wonderful editor.
In the short time we have, how does that relationship work? Do you go to her and say, I have an idea for a new book and here's what I'd like to do, or does she come to you, or how does that symbiosis work?
I go to her, but it used to be, before Macmillan bought Athenaeum, it used to be that I could write to her and say, just a one-page letter, and say, I have this idea for a book. She'd send me a contract, half my advance. And all that changed when Macmillan took over, and now I have to come up with a complete manuscript and revise it and everything else. And then she has to go to New York. She's living out of town now. And she has to go in and sell it to the salesmen, mainly. And they don't even read it, you know.
Yeah.
She just presents it. It's very frustrating.
Yeah.
I mean, what does salesmen know about literature?
Right. Well, the time has sure gone by fast. I
Are we out of
want
time?
everybody to know the name of the book is Wolf at the Door by Barbara Corcoran. Wonderful story, set right here in Montana, most of it up on Flathead Lake, so if you read this you'll recognize a lot of the places that are talked about. And thanks very much, Barbara, for being
Well,
here.
thank you for having me.
We expect you back again soon. Are you working on anything new? That
Oh,
we can
yes.
think about?
I'm always working on something.
Great. Well, thanks again for being our
Thank
guest
you.
on Undercover. And let me take the last few minutes here to do a little library promo. First of all, I'd like everyone to know that 1994 is a special year for us because it represents 100 years of public library service for Missoula, Montana. Now, we haven't always been in that building over on Main Street. We started out in a small upstairs building, is my understanding, somewhere downtown, and a women's club started the first library here. Then in 1903, we moved into the Carnegie Building, which you may recognize now as the Missoula Museum of the Arts. And we were there until 1974, 20 years ago, when we ended up in the building we are now. So a lot of things have undergone tremendous changes. We found one of the very old library catalogs. It wasn't a card catalog, it was just a little paperback pamphlet. Had 100 books listed in it, I think from 1897. So now we have over 100,000 books and lots of other media, periodicals, CDs, tapes, videos, microfilm. So the world has changed a lot, but we like to think that the library still has the same mission. So what are we doing about our centennial year? Well, we've done a lot of promotion. We have these buttons, we have bookmarkers. We are trying to raise some additional funding for the library through private donations. And we're calling this Centennial Fund, and we're going to buy books and only books with it, and 100% of it goes to purchase books. We don't have any overhead. We don't have any administrative cost. All that's being done by the Friends of the Library and library staff, either on library time or on volunteer time. So if you haven't received a letter in the mail asking you to donate to our Centennial Book Fund, you may, and if you don't, you're still perfectly able to do so. All you need to do is write a check to the Friends of the Missoula Public Library for whatever amount you feel you can give. And again, we aren't going any high-tech with this Centennial Fund. We're still going to buy books. And books are still the heart of our library and every library, and I think will be for the foreseeable future. People who predict a bookless society, I think, are actually sort of way off the deep end. I'm convinced that books are going to be around for a long, long time, and it's really important to us to be able to buy books to meet the demand. And no matter how much of an increase we're able to get in our budget, which usually isn't ever very much, we just have not been able to meet the demand here in Missoula. We have now over 40,000 people with library cards checking out almost 600,000 items a year from our library. And so it's really tough for us to keep up with the demand for materials and information. So that's why we're doing this centennial promotion and hoping to get some private donations. And we already have gotten over $1,600. So we're still hoping for more in 1994. To go along with that, the library does more than just be there. We also present programs. I wanted to talk a little more about the book discussion program that we have on the third Thursday of every month. We discuss mostly contemporary fiction, but we've also done some classics. Sometimes we try to tie in with what's going on in the movies, like we did Edith Wharton's book, Ethan Frome, and we've decided to do Age of Innocence at a future date since she has resurfaced as an author people are reading again. We are doing some Amy Tan books, a number of other contemporary authors. We meet at 7 o'clock on the third Thursday of every month, and if you want more information, if you'd like to join book discussion, please give me a call at 721-2665-721-BOOK. And library hours, we're open the same hours year-round. We're open Monday through Thursday, 10 in the morning till 9 in the evening, and Friday and Saturday, 10 to 6. And we have a competent, friendly staff on hand to help you. We realize that we could always use more. We could certainly use more volunteers. We are stressed out to the max trying to serve this community, which is a growing community, and we have not increased our staff at all for a number of years. In fact, we've had cutbacks from where we used to be 10 years ago. So we're doing everything we can to keep up with the demand for library service in Missoula, and sometimes it's a really difficult job for us to do. We do appreciate the support that we get from everyone in the community, and especially I want to thank the people who serve on all the volunteer boards that we work with. The Board of Trustees, which is appointed by the city and county, the Friends of the Library. There are about 400 paid members, and they have a board of 5 people who work very hard to help us and have provided us with a lot of additional funds that we couldn't get any other way. And then the Library Foundation, which is a fairly newly formed organization that's helping to build an endowment for us. So, thank you very much, Barbara, again for being our guest. Name of the book is Wolf at the Door, and we'll see you next month. And our speaker tonight is Dee McNamer, who graciously consented from Alabama, where she was.
Going back now.
Yeah, I know. I thought that would sound better if you came in. Anyway, when I first contacted you, you were in Alabama, though, teaching. And she was our speaker 3 years ago when her first novel came out, and her second novel's now out, and I thought it would be really nice to have her back to talk about that. And so you are on.
Well, it's nice to be here again. I'm going to speak, or this is going to be a version of an article that I wrote for the Montana Historical Society's magazine. I never really pictured myself writing for that magazine because I'm not a historian, but they asked me, and I thought it was an interesting question, and I thought it might be interesting to you, why I chose to do this second book as fiction instead of nonfiction. Gained by. So I had to think about that a little bit, and I did have a lot of actual materials, actual family history to work with, and there's a temptation to write it as nonfiction just for the pure power of the factual truth. But this is an attempt to tell you why I didn't do that. The book is set in the 20s, for the most part, in north central Montana, where my first novel, Rima in the Weeds, was set. And this is kind of in some vague sense, a prequel to that era. It would be Margaret of Rima in the Weeds' grandparents, probably. And my own grandparents, in fact, did go out on the train from the Midwest to northern Montana in 1909, and both of them homesteaded and failed at homesteading and went on to successive adventures up there. So I had some real stuff to draw on. Many, if not most, Montanans know that Jack Dempsey, the world heavyweight boxing champion, defended his title in Shelby on the 4th of July, 1923. Not so many know that the day was so hot that reporters yelped when they touched the keys of their typewriters, or that the first person to occupy a $55, 1923 dollars ringside seat was a young boy who seemed to have arrived on his own from where else? Butte. Or that one of the early sounds of that long summer day was the whine of stunt planes wobbling over the white pine arena that glittered in the morning sun, an arena that covered 6 acres and looked from the air as outsized and unearthly as the Sphinx. It was just, when you see photos of it, it's just outlandish. Most or many of us know the historical facts of the fight, that a group of local boosters, including my own grandfather, raised more than $250,000 1923 dollars to stage this fight, hoping to put Shelby and its youngster oil field on the map. That the big crowds failed to show up, and that more than a few people went seriously broke. What most people don't know is what it was like to be there. There aren't that many people left alive who actually were at the fight. There are some, and I'm going up to Shelby actually this week, and I'll be talking to some of them. But there aren't that many. So I figured that a novelist, a writer of fiction, is basically in the transport business. That our job is not to tell you about people in a particular time, in a particular place. It's to literally and simply to take you there and to use every trick in the bag, including the facts, to do it. When I began to write One Sweet Quarrel, a book which I knew would be concerned in some way with an actual event, the prize fight, I had to decide how much of a historian I was going to be, or going to try to be. Should I restrict myself to verifiable facts that were based on rigorous and impeccable research, and construct a narrative out of those materials, or should I use the facts and the artifacts in a different sort of way as instigators of the imagination? I decided on the latter. Here's an example of how that process worked for me anyway. Halley's Comet was visible in the night sky on May 18th, 1910. That is a fact. You can look that one up. In Manhattan, a number of people convened along Riverside Drive, away from the big buildings, to try to glimpse the comet through a cloud cover. Some of them held bottles aloft, little glass bottles aloft, to try to catch some comet dust. That is a documented fact. I had a great aunt named Daisy Lou who left the Midwest as a young woman to try for a time to become a singing star in Manhattan. And that is a fact. I never met this great aunt, but I found myself, as I wrote this book, trying to imagine someone like her. And when I did, I thought, wouldn't it have been interesting if a Daisy Lou kind of person had been in Manhattan when the comet arced across the sky? Wouldn't it have seemed some kind of blessing on her own aspirations to be present at such a dazzling moment? Perhaps most importantly, I thought, wouldn't the image of a grave young woman trying to catch comet dust in a glass bottle somehow take a reader to Riverside Drive on a May night in 1910? And my answers were yes, yes, and yes. And so I concocted a character named Daisy Lou who bore only a surface resemblance to my great aunt Daisy Lou, and I simply put her there on Riverside Drive with a comet-trapping bottle in her hand. Later on in the book, I put her in a summer dress and sat her down at the arena in Shelby to watch the prize fight and to think about what she was seeing. In her hand, I put a souvenir oil derrick, something that was actually sold at the fight. That is what you can do in fiction. You can make up people and put them in a time and a place that actually existed and set them to thinking their own peculiar thoughts. Newspaper accounts of the fight do, in fact, talk about reporters who yelped when they touched their sun-fried typewriter keys, and about the boy from Butte and the stunt plane scaring everyone witless. Those are the kinds of details that might, for an historian, be interesting but peripheral. For the fiction writer, they're central, because they're the kinds of details that help you to see. And if you can see, you can feel yourself to be there. For One Sweet Quarrel, I pored over daily newspapers at the creaky old annex of the New York Public Library. If anybody's ever been there, it's a horror, but it has everything, to find out how the premier sports writers of the day, in 1923, the Damon Runyons, the Haywood Bruins, who all covered this fight, described Shelby and its big stunt. It was a horrible process. You have to walk off Times Square, you know, the worst part of Times Square, into a worse part on 44th Street or something, and then you go into this old building and the handles fall off when you're trying to do the microfilms, and the copier makes these smeary little messes. But finally I got out of there with a sheaf of stuff, and they really ran on, so I had a lot of stuff. Reporters got real space in newspapers back then. You know, that's how people learned news then. And it was up to them to provide their readers with the disembodied facts, but also with the kinds of visual details that we get now on television. And they really did it. In column after column of newsprint, I learned the facts, how much money had been raised, what were the chances that the stunt could be pulled off, who were the money men, and so on, the regular kinds of public facts, information. But more importantly, for my purposes, I also got mental pictures to look at and wonder about. They described, they were cooling their heels for quite a while in Shelby because they didn't know if this fight was going to come off or not. So, and it was every day, you know, maybe yes, maybe no. So some of them were hanging around Dempsey's camp outside Great Falls or up in Shelby for 2 or 3 weeks before the fight happened. And they had to file stuff. So they described the mud of Shelby streets, the lines at the outhouses, the playbill at the King Tut nightclub. One of them, with time on his hands, went to a vaudeville show in a building near the railroad tracks. The stage, he said, was a cottage the set was a cottage surrounded by trellises of roses. The actors declaimed and warbled, and behind them, through an open window, these big steamers these trains pounded through Shelby, drowning out everything that they said. And that seemed an image to look at and think about. Eventually, I took 3 of my made-up characters to that vaudeville show and sat them in the front row wearing the sunglasses they had bought from a concessionaire down the street. To find out about the look of the fight itself, I went to a place called the Big Fights, Inc. in Midtown Manhattan, this murky and windowless suite of rooms high up a skyscraper. No windows, I remember. A secretary with a Bronx accent smoking a cigarette, chatting with me while a guy named Steve went through all these shelves of actual film footage of boxing matches and brought out the Dempsey-Gibbons fight of 1923 and set me up he didn't charge me, he didn't know what I was really up to. He set me up at this viewing machine and just let me stay and watch it for as long as I wanted to. I watched it several times, maybe 3 or 4 times, as these 2 young boxers went at it for 15 rounds under a blazing Shelby sun. In one sweet quarrel, I make up a bunch of Shelby citizens and have them watch film footage of the fight at a commemorative banquet in 1973, the 50th anniversary of the fight. I'm able to describe the film because I saw it. The banquet is a concoction. What the characters think about the film, what they notice in it, are the observations of concocted people. And the scene then becomes finally a kind of hybrid of the documentary and the imagined. Every writer knows about serendipity, how the most accidental kinds of discoveries can sometimes be the most important ones, the ones that blow life into a story that is struggling to its feet. When I had been working on this novel for about a year, my parents moved from one house to another and discovered a forgotten box of letters in the basement. Most of the letters were written between 1921 and 1923 and were an almost weekly correspondence between my grandfather, Bruce, and his parents back in Batavia, Illinois, and between him and his sister, Daisy Lou, struggling along in Manhattan. Here's the amazing part of the story. My grandfather, living with his family in Cut Bank and then Shelby during those years, had made carbon copies of his own typed letters and had straight pinned those copies to the responses from Batavia and from Manhattan. So instead of half a story, which is what you usually get with a bunch of letters, I actually had a conversation. And it was basically a good Methodist kid out in Montana trying to give his parents an acceptable version of this deeply peculiar thing he'd done by going off to try and become an oil tycoon or whatever he thought he was going to do in Montana. And I knew more by then, so I could see how he was presenting himself, and I could kind of read between the lines. And also because they never called on the phone. That would have just been, for maybe not even deaths, I don't think then. And his parents, in fact, maybe once went to Shelby and saw their grandkids. It was such an enormous seeming journey for relatively poor people then that he included, somewhat guiltily, I think, lots of daily details, what the kids got for Christmas, what they said when they opened up the presents from Batavia, and all of this stuff. And so there's this great, mundane but fascinating, for me, record. And it's so mundane in so many ways that once in a while when a big tragedy would happen, which it did every now and then, a nephew dying suddenly of diphtheria and the nephew's mother's father dying the same week, that kind of thing. It was just heartrending when it would show up in these letters. And I would know it was coming because I also had a bunch of little journals that my grandfather kept, those little one-line logs, and I knew what was going to happen over a span of 79 years. So I could read these letters and go, oh, they're on the verge of this. So it was really enthralling. What I got from those letters was some idea of the daily life of an ordinary family on the High Line, which was pivotal to the story I was trying to tell. You know, what the children got for Christmas, what it was like to drive a Model T out onto the prairie to take a look at this new oil field, the dailynesses, the hopeful voice of a man who was trying to make a life in a place that was harder and chancier than the place he came from. A man who must have sensed in those carbon copies that he was living through an era that we, the ones who are finishing the century he began, might possibly want to know about. As I mentioned, the box also contained these missives from his sister, Daisy Lou, who was trying to carve out her stage career. The problem with Daisy Lou, it seemed, was that she didn't have very much talent. And she was sort of she was interested in esoteric religions. She ultimately ended up becoming, she was Christian. She was interested in Christian Science and Theosophy and all of this stuff. And finally was some kind of major person in the Baha'is in Illinois. So she ultimately made religion her role. But then she was this old-fashioned, rather staid-looking young woman who goes to New York to try and make this singing career right when the jazz age is hitting. And so she's singing her art songs and auditioning and, you know, going broke, and it was, and keeping up this valiant front. Lots of exclamation marks in these letters. Well, she wrote to her brother, my grandfather, after a particularly grueling round of singing auditions, "A Mr. Ward took me into his office and tried to kiss me, and I drew myself up and I said, 'Mr. Ward, if you are buying voices, mine is for sale. If, however, you are buying bodies, mine is not for sale.' He got terrible red, and he turned to me and said, 'Miss McNamer, I fear you have a problem. I fear you are simply too spiritual for musical comedy.'" Exclamation mark. Well, oh, she went on, "It's so awful out here, but I try and I say my prayers and keep going." How could you not want to imagine more about a character like that when you read these letters? I didn't use the letters verbatim, but I pored over them for images, for small stories, for a distinctive way of speaking. Letters are wonderful ways to essentially get a first-person voice. You know, they're saying, I did this, everyone has their own way of speaking, even when they think they're being more formal in letters. They aren't actual letters, although they're printed as actual letters in the book. They're concoctions based on actual letters. I found myself with toward the end of writing this, with very odd, long lists of questions that I wanted to answer correctly. Not simply to be historically accurate, but to give a made-up story the feel of something real. I didn't want anybody to read it and go, hey, there were no short hemlines yet in 1919. So I had to I had these odd lists. Had hemlines jumped to the knee by 1920? You know, would Seattle have had red fire trucks that same year? Would a geologist in 1919 imagine a glacier in northern Montana as tall as the Empire State Building? Whoops, it hadn't been built. Make that the Woolworth Building. What's a skidoo, which is this little kind of milk train, one-car train thing that they commuted really with along the High Line. And it was mentioned with no explanation in these letters of my grandfather's. I also listened to dozens of oral histories at the Historical Society in Helena, sifting through them for the kinds of details that would, I hoped, transport a reader to that time in the way that they transported me listening to them. And I was reminded again as I listened to these people, what they did was they sent out, it was some kind of grant in the 80s, and they sent out a bunch of college kids and interviewed people who were then at least in their 80s, many of them, and had homesteaded, many of them. And I was just reminded again when I listened to these that what we remember over a long life is not data. It is it's not population figures, political candidates, all the kinds of things that the drier books of history make sure to include, economic trends. It is the sensory detail is what we remember. Names of neighbors and presidents fade, political battles and economic trends flee the memory. One woman couldn't remember the name of her first husband. She thought he was a nice guy, but she couldn't quite get his name down, but she remembered exactly what a pail of water during the drought looked like with all these little red bugs floating on the surface of it. So what sticks are images, how a cook spit on the stove of a railway cafe in Glendive to test how hot it was. The way a tumbleweed was decorated with popcorn to make a dryland Christmas tree. How good a dancer that Chester boy was who died in the Great War. How exactly he moved his light-booted feet. They remember that, and that's the kinds of things we will remember, I think. That's the kind of detail that lives. That's the kind of detail I tried to use in this book. I wanted a reader to feel that he or she was actually remembering an era, himself or herself, with me, remembering with me an era rather than being told about it by me. All of that might seem some kind of dismissal of a rather serious kind of question. It gets asked in a number of fancy ways, but I think what it boils down to is this: how free should a fiction writer feel to tinker with historical fact? We've all seen these kind of docudramas and Kennedy movies where you don't know where the real footage leaves off and the concocted stuff starts. And I think, that it's a valid question. If Damon Runyon had not traveled to Shelby to cover the prize fight, could I, the writer, say that he did? Could I put him there? Could I could, of course. I mean, on the face of it, a book that's labeled a novel, to me, signals that it is in large part concoction, and without any great long explanatory note or acknowledgments or footnotes, you aren't often going to know exactly what was concocted or what wasn't. But I really have strong reservations about doing really blatant manipulating of verifiable fact, because I think it's because I worked for a dozen years as a journalist, and I believe in the value of a verifiable record of events and the people who were present at them. I would feel uncomfortable about putting a public figure, a historical figure like Runyon, say, in a place where he hadn't been, unless I had in some way signaled the reader that they should expect these kinds of transmigrations. Eudora Welty does it when she wrote a story that is fiction. It's like, what if Audubon met, I can't even remember who it was now, but on the Natchez Trace and they had this conversation. Well, you've been signaled in the way that she's writing that it's a what if, a big what if. But the form of this was much more historical and straightforward, I think. And I didn't feel that I'd done that kind of signaling, so I didn't want to mess around in that kind of way. The novelist Mario Vargas Llosa says about the slippery realm of fiction that literature is not a transposition of living experience. Real and important knowledge about reality always comes out of literature, but it comes through lies, through a distortion of reality, through a transformation of reality by imagination. A novelist wants to make a person believe in a world, a separate reality, and tinkering with historical facts will be jarring to those readers who know the facts and will interrupt their participation in that concocted world. And so just aesthetically, that's the best reason I can think of to refrain from wild divergences of verifiable fact. They break the spell, that's all. And if you can do it in a way that doesn't break the spell, then fine. I just didn't think I could in this book. Ordinary characters are another matter. With the generous blessing of my father and his siblings, I pilfered my own family's history to some extent in writing this book. But the further along I got, the further those characters became their own people, independent of their progenitors, increasingly independent of me, the writer. And so by the time I'd finished the book, they were out there decidedly on their own. So that's, you know, that part of a book, the made-up characters that just gets more and more fictional. It's very difficult, I think, not to do that. And so that's basically my explanation of what I wanted to, why I chose fiction, apart from maybe some of the more obvious reasons, which are that you can run around in space and time, and you can get inside people's heads in an authoritative kind of way.